The air was alive with the hum of crickets and the gentle croak of frogs as the villagers gathered by the riverside. The moon hung low, its silver light spilling over the lush valley and dancing on the surface of the winding river. Around the crackling fire, laughter mingled with the soft murmur of voices, creating a symphony of peace. The village, small yet vibrant, was a place where tradition thrived and life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Elder Namdi, his face etched with the wisdom of years, leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of countless stories. "It was by this very river," he began, "that our ancestors first laid the foundation of this village, and here, the river has never failed to provide." His words were met with nods of agreement, for the river was their lifeblood, feeding their fields and quenching their thirst. Among the listeners was Obinna, his eyes fixed on the elder, yet his thoughts far away. He was a young man with a restless heart, one that yearned for more than the village could offer. While others marveled at the simple beauty of the land, Obinna dreamed of distant cities, glittering wealth, and the respect he believed only riches could bring. When the traveling trader appeared, cloaked in mystery and tales of grandeur, Obinna's imagination ignited like dry grass in a spark. The trader's voice was smooth, like the river's flow, as he spun stories of lands where gold was as common as sand, and opportunity awaited the bold. The villagers listened with awe, but none more intently than Obinna. Adana, sitting close to her husband, watched his expression change. She knew that look, the one that signaled his heart had already begun to chase a dream. Her voice, calm yet firm, broke through the crowd's chatter. "Such stories can be as dangerous as they are enchanting," she said, her gaze locking with Obinna's. "What good is gold if it costs us what we already hold dear?" Obinna smiled at her, but it was a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Adana," he said softly, "I only want what is best for you, for our family. The world is vast, and we cannot grow if we stay in one place forever." Elder Namdi, hearing the exchange, placed his gnarled hand on his walking stick and stood. His voice carried authority, tempered with care. "Obinna, the river flows far, yet it always returns to its source. Do not let the allure of faraway lands blind you to the wealth of what you already have." But the seed of ambition had been planted, and it grew quickly in Obinna's heart. That night, as the fire burned low and the villagers dispersed to their homes, Obinna made his decision. He would leave the village and return with riches that would secure his family's future. His resolve was as firm as the earth beneath his feet. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the valley, Obinna stood at the edge of the village. His bag was light, carrying only essentials, and his heart was heavy with the burden of his promise. Adana stood beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do not let the world change you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Remember who you are, Obinna."
Wadia.
"I promise, Adana," he said, taking her hands in his. "I will return, and when I do, you will see a better life waiting for us." The villagers gathered to bid him farewell, their faces a mixture of pride and apprehension. Elder Namdi, his eyes shadowed with worry, stepped forward. "Go with care, Obinna, and may you always find your way back to the roots that anchor you." Obinna nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. He turned and began his journey, his figure growing smaller as he moved toward the horizon. Behind him, the village seemed to hold its breath, caught between hope and fear for the young man who sought to grasp a future as elusive as the wind. The path stretched before Obina, winding through the forest like a serpent gliding between trees. The village had gathered to bid him farewell, their voices subdued by a mix of pride and quiet unease. Adana stood apart, her hands clutched tightly before her. "Obina," she said softly, her voice trembling as though her words might break the silence. "Remember that riches mean nothing if you lose yourself to find them." He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Adana," he said, his tone firm, "I will return as a man worthy of your faith. This journey is not just for me, it is for us." With a final glance toward Elder Nyamdi, who stood solemnly at the edge of the crowd, Obina turned and began his journey, his resolve like an unyielding flame. The forest greeted him with towering trees whose canopies danced with the whispers of the wind. The air was thick with the sense of earth and life. Days passed as Obina made his way through the vast expanse, meeting strangers along the path. An old woman, bent with age but sharp of mind, offered him a piece of fruit and spoke gently. "Young man," she said, "the forest is as generous as it is treacherous. Accept what it gives with gratitude, but tread carefully where greed might lead you." Obina nodded, thanking her, but her words lingered in his mind like a faint melody. Not long after, a traveler clad in fine clothes crossed his path. The man, carrying a satchel heavy with gold, spoke of shortcuts and hidden riches deep within the forest. "You seem like a man who wants more," the traveler said, his voice smooth like oil. "There are ways to quicken your success, but only for those willing to take risks." Obina hesitated but declined. "I seek a future for my family, not an easy road," he said, though the man's words left a bitter taste of doubt. The forest gave way to the arid expanse of the desert. Each step was an act of defiance against the burning sun and endless dunes. Obina's strength waned, but his determination held firm. One night, as he rested by a dying fire, a shadow emerged from the darkness. A traveler, his face veiled and his voice as hollow as the wind. "We suffer so?" the figure asked. "I can show you a path that leads to wealth without struggle. All it requires is your trust." Obina's heart wavered, but he shook his head. "Trust is earned, not demanded," he replied. The figure's laughter echoed into the night, leaving Obina alone with his doubts. When the desert finally gave way to the city, Obina was struck by its grandeur. Towering structures of stone and clay seemed to pierce the sky, and the air buzzed with the clamor of merchants, traders, and entertainers. Yet the splendor was overwhelming, almost suffocating. He wandered the streets, unsure of his place in this chaos, when he was approached by a group of merchants cloaked in silken robes. "Ah, a seeker of fortune," one of them said, his eyes gleaming like polished stones. "We have what you desire, riches beyond your imagining, but at a cost." They whispered of a task that promised untold wealth, the retrieval of an artifact from a sacred forest. Before Obina could respond, an elderly man with deep lines etched into his face stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of years. "Young man, beware those who promise much but ask little in return. Riches born of greed are shackles, not freedom." Obina's brow furrowed, but he dismissed the man's warning. "I am not greedy," he replied. "I seek only what is fair for the efforts I am willing to make." The sacred forest loomed ahead, its entrance a tangle of ancient trees that seemed to breathe with life. Obinna stepped forward, each step a test of his courage. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. His resolve wavered as eerie whispers seemed to follow him, but he pressed on, determined to prove his worth. When he finally reached the artifact, its beauty was otherworldly. A golden figure, carved with intricate symbols, shimmered faintly in the dim light. Obinna reached for it, his hand trembling. As his fingers closed around it, the forest seemed to shudder. A low, guttural sound, almost like laughter, echoed through the trees. He clutched the artifact to his chest, feeling a rush of triumph tempered by an unshakable sense of dread. The journey back was fraught with unease. Obinna's steps felt heavier, and the once vivid world around him seemed to dull. At night, his dreams were filled with shadows that whispered his name. By day, the artifact seemed to pulse in his hands, its surface unnaturally warm. Obinna paused one evening, the weight of his journey pressing down on him. He stared at the artifact, its golden surface now appearing almost sinister. "What have I done?" he murmured to himself, the forest's whispers seeming to answer, but their meaning eluded him. Still, he pressed on, determined to fulfill his promise, unaware that his ambition had set a chain of events into motion that could not be undone. Obinna's return was met with a mix of celebration and unease. The villagers had gathered near the edge of the forest, their faces alight with hope. Children ran ahead, calling out, "He is back! Obinna has returned!" The crowd surged forward, eager to greet the man who had ventured far to bring them prosperity. But as Obinna stepped into the clearing, murmurs rippled through the crowd. His once bright eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, and his shoulders slumped, as though bearing an invisible weight. He clutched the artifact tightly, holding it up for all to see. "I have done it," he proclaimed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This artifact will bring us the wealth we have dreamed of. No longer will our children hunger, and no longer will we toil without reward." For a moment, there was applause, but it quickly faded. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes drawn to the artifact. It shimmered, golden and beautiful, but something about it felt wrong. Elder Namdi stepped forward, his staff thudding softly against the ground. "Obinna," the elder said, his voice heavy with concern. "What have you brought into our home?" Obinna frowned. "Elder, this is the key to our future. I risked my life to bring it here." Elder Nyamdi's gaze lingered on the artifact. "Not all that glitters brings light. I fear this may cast a shadow greater than we can bear." Days passed, and the shadows began to take shape. The first sign was the death of a calf, found lifeless with no visible wounds. Then, the crops began to wither. Healthy plants turned brown and brittle overnight. The river, once clear and lively, seemed to run slower, its water murky and thick. Fear crept into the village. People whispered of curses and dark spirits. Families stayed indoors at night, and the once bustling community became eerily silent. Obinna watched helplessly as the village descended into chaos. One evening, Elder Nyamdi gathered the villagers. Standing at the center of the square, his voice was steady but somber. "This is not the first time greed has brought ruin to a village," he began. "Many years ago, a man like Obinna sought riches at the cost of his people. He too brought back a cursed object. and his village was consumed by darkness. The elder's words struck Obinna like a blow. "Are you saying this is my fault?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I only wanted to help. I did this for all of you." Lee sighed. For Iasuk, Elder Nandi placed a hand on Obinna's shoulder. "Intentions do not change the outcome, my son, but there is still a way to undo what has been done." "What must I do?" Obinna asked, his voice trembling. "The spirits tied to this artifact demand balance," the elder said. "A life must be given to break its hold." The villagers gasped, and Obinna's heart sank. "A life? You mean mine?" Elder Numdi nodded. "Only the one who brought it can return it to peace." Obinna turned to the crowd. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "But if my life is the price to save my family, my village, then I will pay it." The villagers were silent, their faces etched with grief. Adana stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Obinna, you don't have to do this," she pleaded. "There must be another way." He cupped her face in his hands. "Adana, you have always been my strength. Take care of our family. Tell them my story so they may learn from my mistakes." That night, under the elder's guidance, the ritual began. Obinna stood before the artifact, the villagers forming a circle around him. As he placed his hands on the golden surface, it began to glow. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it became a deafening roar. Obinna cried out, and the artifact shattered, sending shards of light into the night sky. When the light faded, Obinna was gone. The artifact lay in pieces at the elder's feet, its power broken. The villagers stood in silence, their hearts heavy with loss. But as dawn broke, they saw signs of renewal. The river ran clear again, the crops stood tall, and the air was filled with the sounds of life. Adana stood at the edge of the field, holding her children close. "Your father was a brave man," she said softly. "He gave everything to save us. Never forget his sacrifice." Elder Namdi's voice rose above the morning breeze. "Let this be a lesson for us all. True wealth is not found in gold or silver, but in the love we share and the values we uphold." The villagers nodded, their sorrow mingled with a renewed sense of purpose. Obinna's story would be told for generations, a reminder of the dangers of greed and the power of redemption. The village, though scarred by loss, found its way back to harmony, the lessons of the past guiding them into a brighter future.